Hello guys, thanks for dropping by. In this one I'm gonna show you how I created this scene from Terminator 2. All in all, this took me about 2 days to finish, because for some reason I thought it'd be a fun idea to create everything from scratch. So that's what I did. I also ran into a fair bit of problems along the way and had to redo a couple of things, but I'm gonna show you all of that, so hopefully you can extract some knowledge from this or just some inspiration for your next project. So starting off, I just imported this reference image to use as reference when I'm sculpting the skull, and in the sculpting tab I enabled a dynamic topology to give me more geometry when I'm working on the small scale details. And then I just started blocking out the general shape of the skull and then slowly started refining the shape. And once I was happy with how that turned out, I used a remesh modifier to smooth out the geometry and make sure it was even all over the mesh. To create the head of the Terminator, I used this skull model that I created, and then I added in a plane, and using these modifiers I could just start to extrude and kind of follow the shape of the skull like this and try to match it to the reference image. And I didn't care about making this scene 100% accurate, I just tried to get the general shape and feel of the Terminator. So right here you can see I'm just creating some random detail. Then I used booleans to cut out this part of the mesh, rotated it, and boom, I got a lower jaw. Here comes the fun part. I created a bunch of different kind of pistons or pipes that I gave lots of random details, and then I could just duplicate them and move them wherever I needed them in my sculpt. So right here, for example, I used this piston to kind of outline the shape of the jaw. This method is kind of like kit bashing, but you're creating the small scale models all by yourself and then just dragging them into your sculpt wherever you need them. So it's a pretty useful method, and it gives a lot of free detail without having to model everything from scratch. Then I created some teeth just using a subdivided cube, placed them on the sculpt and gave them a bone looking material. So here you can see I'm using the exact same method to create the feet, and I kind of jumped forward a little bit so you wouldn't have to see me sculpt this entire thing, but I just used the same method. And once I was happy with how that was looking, I created this basic armature to be able to pose and animate my Terminator. So just in edit mode I'm just extruding these legs and mirroring them to the opposite side like that. And here I started with the pretty painstaking process of parenting these parts to the armature. But once that was done, I had a Terminator model that I could pose and animate in the scene. Next step was to model this blaster, and here I'm just extruding different parts of a cube and just eyeballing it, trying to match the shape from the original. Looking back, I wish I would have put a little bit more effort into creating this model, because it kind of stood out as a little bit low poly in the final scene, but you know, it worked. To make the Terminator hold this blaster, instead of posing the hand with armatures, I simply posed it in edit mode, kind of made it wrap around the handle like that. And after parenting the blaster to the hand bone, it looks like the Terminator is holding it. Oh there buddy, calm down! Then I added in a ground plane and started blocking out the general composition of the scene and keyframed some really basic animation for the camera and the Terminator. I changed the camera angles a little bit later, just trying to match it a little better to the original scene. Then I gave the ground a dirt texture and displaced it a little bit. Then I also created these dirt piles that I used to give a little bit more detail to the environment. And I just joined these ones in the back and decimated them to get rid of unnecessary geometry. Then it was time to start working on this bike that we can see in the background of the scene. So I'm just using this reference image, and from the side view I'm just roughly matching it. We're gonna use this model many times, so I still put a little bit of effort into it. Here I'm using booleans to cut holes in the pedals. It's pretty cool. Then I placed them in the scene together with loads of skulls. Then I went on to create this swing set, and to allow the swings to actually move in the wind, I'm using a cloth simulation with a vertex group for pinning. A central part of this scene is the destruction of the skull once the Terminator steps on it, so I wanted to put a little bit of effort into it. Here I'm using the explode modifier to fracture the skull into loads of small pieces, and then I'm going back and joining some of them together to give a little bit of randomness to the size of the pieces. This method works really great when you have something that will just explode all of a sudden. Otherwise I would use cell fracture. Then I made these pieces rigid bodies and gave them a solidify modifier to give them some depth. I experimented with different different ways of having the foot react with these rigid bodies. So you can see here I use a cube and parented it to the foot, but that didn't really work because the pieces just exploded outwards. So I think in the end I just gave the actual foot object a rigid body, but the destruction is happening so quick so you won't really see the details of that interaction there. I thought it would be cool if some of the pieces got wedged between the ground and the foot and kind of leave an empty shell of the skull. So I just joined some of the pieces together, so I got these bigger pieces and removed the rigid bodies and then manually animated them to kind of flare outwards once the foot stomps down on them. I thought that was a really nice touch. To bring it all together a little bit more, I added a sphere, cut it in half and then scaled it down on the Z-axis. Then I could use this sphere to emit some particles, so I made this collection with these small pieces of debris and just made it emit all of those at the frame of impact. So now we have a little bit of small scale debris to go along with the destruction. But then I was thinking, how could we bring this to another level? So I added in 2 shape keys, and on one of them I sculpted the ground to kind of form around the foot where it landed, to give the effect that it kind of dug into the ground a little bit. And then I animated that shape key to turn on when the foot landed on the ground. So now the actual ground moves a little bit once the foot lands. And I'm not really sure if that's going to be visible in the final render, but it just felt like a cool thing to do. Then I created a separate scene and started working on some of these explosions in the background. Creating explosions inside of Blender is a whole process in and of itself, so I'm not gonna cover that in depth in this video. But if you're interested in learning more about Blender's fire and smoke system, I have a separate video covering all of that, so I'll link it down below for those of you who are interested. Once I was happy with my explosions, I went ahead and imported those into my original scene and adjusted the frame start to kind of match how the explosions happen in the original scene. Then I just created this giant box to cover my entire scene and gave it a volumetric material. Here you can see I'm also playing around with depth of field and trying to get something that I like. Since I knew I was gonna render this in Eevee, I had to find a way to cheat how the fire illuminates the environment. Basically all I did was just animate a point lamp to follow the mass of the fire and keyframed it to light up with the fire. To give the eyes a little bit of detail, I just insetted all the faces and hit Alt-E to extrude them along their normals. I knew I wanted to create these blue lasers all inside of Blender, so I thought of a way to do that using particle systems. To create the actual laser, I just created this stretched out cube and parented a blue lamp to the front of it. Then I could put those into a new collection and tell this particle system right here to shoot them outwards. I had to play around a little bit with the settings to have the lasers actually line up with the direction that they were traveling in, but I found out that if you use dynamic on the rotation, you get that kind of effect. So that's a pretty useful tip for you. The scene was feeling kind of empty by now, so I added in these debris assets to the foreground and also placed these broken buildings in the background. I made these ones for another project, but basically I used the same method that I used for the skull, but only on parts of the buildings, so they kind of look destroyed like that. To add to the foggy atmosphere of the scene, I also added in these drifting smoke assets that I made just like the explosion, and that just added a little bit of movement to the fog. By now it was looking pretty good, so I did some test renders and was pretty happy with the result. This is how the footage looked straight from Blender, and with a little bit of post-processing and some color grading, this is how the final scene turned out.